Nobody has had it harder in life than Vladimir Putin since he first took mercy on the Russian people and took power as his nation's president in the year 2000. Putin has presided over a period of incredible economic recovery, rooted out all the dangerous Western poisons of corruption and dissent, and given the entire Russian world the strong leader that it has always deserved. But between those ungrateful intellectuals and those jealous Western puppets, there's always someone trying to bring him down. When he tries to unify Russia, they accuse him of being a tyrant. When he tries to rebuild the rightful Russian state, they accuse him of threatening NATO. And when he tries to carry out a very quick special military operation against that Nazi Volodymyr Zelensky, they accuse him of being a warmonger against Nazis. What? To hear the Russian Federation tell it, Russia under Vladimir Putin might have never done anything wrong, but watching from around the world, and especially from Europe, our lying eyes would tell us a different story. Russia that is notoriously corrupt, brutally repressive toward its own people, and has an appetite for conquest that extends far beyond Ukraine's western border. But Russia's cognitive dissonance, it's not an accident, is it? It's intentional. It's part of a decades-long attempt to gaslight the entire world into accepting Russia's version of events. When Russian drones swarm Polish airspace, when Russian fighter jets thunder over Estonia, these aren't Russian provocations, because, according to Russia, the accusation's not even real. Look, if you ever come across a person who's really good at gaslighting, then you know how hard it can be to keep track of the truth while keeping up with an avalanche of lies. It's not a proper psychological term, and to be fair, it does get misused pretty egregiously, but the concept of gaslighting has caught on in the 2020s because it speaks to something real. A person who's gaslighting is trying to misrepresent the truth, not just by telling individual lies or by issuing individual denials, but by creating an entire false narrative that they can use to manipulate someone into accepting their specific version of reality. Now, a person who's gaslighting, constantly shutting down even the thought that a differing perspective might have some merit, insisting that it would be irrational and irresponsible to accept any version of the truth except the one that they're trying to present. Facts that run contrary to the gaslighter's preferred view of events are dismissed or denied out of hand, even when the person on the receiving end can clearly recall the reality and knows that the gaslighter was right there when that thing they're saying didn't happen definitely happened. For the person trying to gaslight their way through a situation, the tactic provides control, it makes genuine dispute impossible, and it places themselves at the center of their fabricated truth while pushing the other person down. And unfortunately for the people on the receiving end, it's a tactic that works best of all when the other person is genuinely trying to engage and find common ground. And if you've experienced that kind of interaction in your life, then, well, congratulations, because you and an entire generation of global diplomats have something in common. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has gotten oh so very good at the very same sort of rhetorical judo, manipulating, bending, and outright denying the truth whenever it might be inconvenient. But Russia doesn't just use those tactics to win arguments on the diplomatic stage. Instead, the Putin regime's specific flavor of gaslighting is meant to muddy the waters around its intent and its actions when it comes to warfare. Or really, we should say conflict instead of warfare. A massive part of Putin's approach involves denying the idea that Russia could ever be engaged in a war against anybody at all. I mean, God forbid.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
At the very core of Putin's approach, he and Russia rely on a key failure of the modern world order. The wars and warlike acts of aggression are neatly defined by all sorts of rigid legal constraints, diplomatic and institutional norms, and the global public's understanding about what is, or what isn't, a reasonable cause for concern. Now, if everybody's always acting with the best intentions, then I mean, sure, in that kind of world, there's always time to de-escalate and meet at the negotiating table so that wars never have to break out. But if an actor within that international order wants to undermine or sow confusion and doubt or use violent, aggressive, coercive, or underhanded tactics to get what they want, then there is so much grey space within our current world order that they could basically just run wild. Russia isn't the only nation on Earth to operate in that grey space by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, most nations operate there to some degree, and certainly any nation that wants to wield power on the global stage. I mean, they absolutely must take part. But Russia still stands out in several ways at once. Moscow's far more willing to act in that grey space than most of its rivals. It invests tremendous resources so that it can go on an offensive there, and it shows a strong preference to use those murky tactics even when it could handle its disputes in the way that the rest of the world does. Russia's got an exceptionally deep bag of tricks compared to its global competitors, and it's willing to smuggle, to steal, sabotage, assassinate, interfere, and even invade using those tools as a matter of course. And although we're going to examine many of Russia's specific actions in a moment, it's important to first understand why that broad tactical approach is effective, because that's mostly the fault of other nations. It's not really the fault of Russia itself. Whether it's the United States, China, India, Brazil, the European nations of NATO, or anybody else, other world powers have to watch what Russia does and figure out how to act as a result. That's the standard course of global affairs, with each nation or alliance reacting and responding to all of the others. But Russia's adversaries in the NATO alliance have proven to be uniquely bad at actually taking a stand. You see, over in NATO, there's a lot of emphasis on things like diplomatic decorum, group unanimity, and establishing clear proof of an offense or an attack before engaging in any form of response. Even more inconvenient, the vast majority of NATO members are still genuinely beholden to a voting public, and it's not always politically expedient to confront a provocation from Russia when issues can be ignored or swept under the rug. So, to draw on a few real-life examples, that means that Russian intelligence can go around poisoning dissidents on European soil, knowing that Europe won't respond directly if the agent responsible can't be easily tied back to the Kremlin. Russia can engage in cyber attacks or acts of sabotage, knowing that if NATO calls Russia out publicly and Russia issues forceful denials, NATO will feel too bound by diplomatic politeness to really press that issue. Russia can meddle in NATO elections, run disinformation campaigns that target NATO member nations, or support international forces that are fighting against NATO troops, because in a 32-member alliance where several member states are friendly with Putin, there's very little chance that NATO will unanimously agree on a response. And when Russia marches its troops into a country that NATO considers a strategically important partner outside the alliance, Russia knows full well that NATO won't be able to justify it to their voting constituents if they decide to take part in a war defending a country that's not even a NATO member. If Russia really overcalculates and overplays its hands, then sure, the consequences could be quite severe, but betting on NATO to find a way to avoid confrontation is historically about as reliable a bet that the sun's gonna rise tomorrow. Just before we go any further, just a quick pause to tell you about something we've been cooking up here at WarFronts, and we are excited to share it. And no, it's not the launch of WeebFronts. Jesus Christ, leave me alone. I've got enough channels. But I think it might be nearly as good as that. So have you ever got to the end of the week and found yourself thinking something along the lines of, oh man, I was just feeling so optimistic about the state of the world, and I'd love for that to be ruined by even more war fronts. That would bring me down nicely. Well, good news for you, my friends. I hear you. In fact, we at WarFronts hear you so loudly, we're launching a brand new... It's that site. Subscriber service. Look at this. I set this up. That's where you can go. It's a place for people who see us putting out 6 videos a week and go, amateurs. For $5 a month, you'll get access to 2 exclusive videos each and every week. The first 2 are already up on whether Poland could win a war against Russia. Pretty timely, we know, you're welcome. And on just how South Korea came to make the best tank on Earth. And we've got a lot more in the pipeline, including a weekly show covering the 3 most important war stories everybody else is ignoring. And as a bonus, our writers are also producing 2 in-depth written articles a week for those of you who like to get their information the old-fashioned way. And now we know what you're thinking, oh man, they're going to paywall videos. This sucks. Look, I have learned from the mistakes that every other YouTuber who launches something like this before me has made. No, we're still on YouTube. Everything is as it was before. There are still those 6 videos a week that we are grinding away making for you. You're so welcome. Everything on fronts.co is a bonus for those of you who want to cough up the princely sum of $5 American a month. So, if you want more of my face delivering important but oh so depressing news straight to your eyeballs, head over to fronts.co. God damn it, it's this side. It's so hard. My preview monitors. Here, fronts.co, not com. I couldn't get the com. The co was expensive enough. That's fronts.co, not com. And now back to today's video. Thank you. It also helps support the show. That wasn't in the copy, but it also helps us make videos, and thank you so much. Back to the episode. Now look, at this point in the episode, we've levied a pretty serious allegation that one of the world's major nuclear powers is regularly engaged in efforts to undermine its adversaries while exploiting their weaknesses and very intentionally fighting in a way that makes those adversaries unlikely to really fight back. But luckily for us, and unluckily for the inevitable wave of pro-Russian accounts coming over from the troll farms, we're able to back up that observation with an absolute deluge of examples. And fair warning for this section, the list that we could have chosen from is just too long for us to cover everything, so if your favorite instance of Russian meddling wasn't included, well, we sincerely apologize. And we'll start with the Russian seizure of Crimea in 2014, a classic example of the lengths that Russia will go to in order to preserve a veneer of plausible deniability. In that instance, Russia dispatched thousands of professional warfighters in unmarked combat uniforms who showed up on the Ukrainian isthmus of Crimea and very quickly seized control of the entire territory. In that instance, Putin would insist for over a year that the troops on the ground, dubbed Little Green Men in the West, weren't Russian, until, well, finally admitting in 2015 that he had ordered his subordinates to seize the territory and directed soldiers to take part. Until that time, Putin and the rest of the Kremlin had maintained that those troops were merely local self-defense forces, and that's also what he said about the groups of soldiers that began popping up shortly afterward in the eastern Ukrainian Donbass region. Again, Russia vehemently denied that any of its troops were involved and flatly refused to entertain NATO accusations to the contrary. And to be clear, Ukraine and NATO were able to produce clear evidence of Russian troops on the ground, but that didn't matter. As long as Russia could give NATO enough of an exit valve that it could avoid actually doing much about the problem, its murky operations could proceed without Western interference. Or we could fast forward to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, something that Putin and his allies refused to even refer to as a war, let alone an invasion, until literal years after the fact. Instead, it was slapped with the now notorious label, a special military operation. During Putin's speech to announce the invasion, he presented an entire fabricated narrative to justify Russia's actions, claiming that Ukraine had been committing an ongoing genocide against Russian speakers in Ukraine's east, and that Ukraine was ruled by neo-Nazis and actively building nuclear weapons. All of those claims have been quite thoroughly shown to be false, but again, that doesn't matter. Instead of presenting evidence to support its claims, Russia has repeatedly insisted that it has evidence and thus regards its own narrative as fact. That deliberate disinformation has continued throughout the war, with Russia claiming that it was provoked into invading Ukraine because of a purported threat to its sovereignty posed by NATO. Again, this is a patently false claim unless we interpret Russia's ability to meddle in other nations' affairs as a matter of its own inviolable statehood, which is a stretch. In reality, it's the geopolitical equivalent of telling somebody, please don't touch me, while wiping your hand all over their face. Advancing Russia's front lines toward NATO and building up preparations for a continental war while maintaining innocence and accusing NATO of doing the very same thing Russia wouldn't admit that it was doing. Putin has routinely denied allegations that his forces committed war crimes in Ukraine, despite clear documentation of precisely that in areas that Ukraine has since recaptured after Russia has been forced back. They've accused Ukraine of building bioweapons, harvesting organs from dead soldiers and even children, and engaging in crucifixion of Russian soldiers and civilians. Hopefully, it goes without saying that there's been no credible evidence to support any of those claims. Then there are all the ways that Putin has sought to change the narrative around Ukraine itself. Russia has embarked on a relentless attack against the very idea of a Ukrainian identity, let alone the idea of a Ukrainian nation. Instead, under the Kremlin's rhetoric, Ukrainians are part of a far larger Russian nation, a single people with no right to separate into a sovereign state. To back up that idea, Putin and his allies have articulated an extensive alternate reading of history, and perhaps more importantly, they've demanded that the world prioritize Russia's version of historical events to decide Ukraine's future instead of prioritizing the geopolitical realities of modern Ukraine or the wishes of its people. In occupied parts of the Donbass region, Russia denies exerting any pressure on Ukrainian civilians, despite the fact that civilians are routinely excluded from healthcare systems, including in emergencies, and barred from receiving elderly pensions unless they can produce a Russian passport. In the lead-up to the war, and in the early going, the Kremlin even insisted that Ukrainian civilians would welcome an invasion from Russia and cheer their soldiers as heroes as they marched through the streets. And that's to say nothing of Russia's continual insistence that it doesn't target civilians, that it doesn't attack civilian infrastructure, and that it does not steal away the thousands of Ukrainian children who've been taken to Russia against the will of their families. Moving outside the war in Ukraine, Russia has employed similar methods all across the globe, dispatching shadowy paramilitary groups to assert Russia's will abroad without uniformed Russian soldiers ever having to deploy outside their country. The most famous of these organizations is, of course, the Wagner Group, but they are far from the only ones, and before Wagner became deeply involved in Russia's full-scale Ukraine invasion, their existence was a relatively well-kept secret of Russian geopolitics. During the 2010s and early 2020s, those paramilitaries locked down control of lucrative resource mines and protected Russia's allied heads of state, often massacring civilians, sometimes killing journalists, and in 2019 attacking American troops in a major battle in Syria. And, well, speaking of Syria, Russia intervened in the country starting back in 2015, continually insisting that it was only there to fight against the Islamic State organization. In reality, Russian troops and air power were used against any and all parties not allied with then-dictator Bashar al-Assad, while frequently striking schools and civilian neighborhoods and performing double-tap strikes to kill emergency responders who were responding to the first Russian bombs that fell at a given location. At times, Russia would even announce its own humanitarian pauses to the fighting before intensifying its bombing runs when those pauses were supposedly in effect. And just as important, Russia has used its gaslighting techniques not just to deny its overt operations, but to dismiss legitimate evidence that implicates Russia in efforts it was attempting to keep hidden. Whether in occupied Ukraine, in Africa, through its paramilitaries, or on its own soil, videos and photographs emerge with relative frequency, accusing Russia and its proxy forces of all manner of heinous conduct on and off the battlefield. But when those items are reported, they're dismissed as fake news, AI, or actors portraying a fantasy, despite having been quite thoroughly verified on the international stage. The same's true for Russia's wartime casualty figures, which it refuses to publish, and any criticism levied toward Russia from Western media or governments. When that criticism is offered, Russia doesn't just issue denials of wrongdoing, it consistently works to reject the very idea that Russia could be legitimately criticized. Any and all criticism, in Russia's telling, is either a blatant fabrication, an expression of anti-Russian political bias, or an intentional act of slander. Then, if Russia cannot force a compelling alternative down the throats of global onlookers, it introduces misinformation and outright disinformation, often confusing or self-contradictory by design, in order to make it far more difficult for a casual onlooker to establish the truth. After all, if Russia can dictate its version of events and force it to be accepted as truth, that's precisely what Russia will do. But if Russia can't decide what the truth is, then it can ensure that nobody can have the truth at all. Now, we trust that our viewing audience, hello there, is aware that, as of now, Vladimir Putin still rules Russia, his inner circle still controls the Kremlin, and the Kremlin still controls Russia's ongoing war and grey zone operations around the world. So, it should be no surprise that these well-tested Russian tactics are still being used today. Unfortunately, though, that's not where the story ends, because right now, Russia isn't just holding steady with its gaslighting efforts. Putin is escalating, and he's escalating in a way that would suggest that something big is coming sooner rather than later. The most obvious recent example would be Russia's repeated violations of NATO airspace, each of them constructed to either give Russia just enough plausible deniability that it can claim innocence, or otherwise to fall short of the kinds of provocation that NATO would have to respond to through the use of force. First, on the nights of September the 9th into the 10th, over 20 Russian drones flew in multiple swarms into Polish airspace. The drones were slow-moving decoys, not loaded with explosives, meaning that they didn't kill anyone, and they couldn't quite be interpreted as an attack, but they did violate NATO airspace en masse, and one of them even landed conveniently outside a base for the Polish Territorial Guard. Russia, of course, denied that the drones were sent intentionally, claiming that Ukrainian jamming had been responsible. That's a highly implausible explanation, given that the drones came in multiple waves, hours apart, and didn't seem to be subject to any different types of Ukrainian jamming than usual. But still, it's not quite impossible. Then there was the overflight of 3 Russian MiG-31 aircraft above the Baltic nation of Estonia, one of the tiny countries on Russia's flank that's at the greatest risk of outright invasion. Those MiG-31s were armed with air-to-air missiles, not ground attack weapons, and they did turn around when they were intercepted, meaning that they weren't quite enough of a threat that NATO couldn't avoid blowing them out of the sky. They also carried pilots, meaning that NATO would risk killing Russian troops by shooting the aircraft down, something that NATO is quite reticent to do. But the planes also spent a full 12 minutes in Estonian airspace at a time when Russia knew damn well that NATO's air defenses were on high alert. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov then insisted that the incident never happened at all and that Russia's jets had operated, quote, strictly within the confines of international law, while it was Estonia that was escalating tensions and provoking a confrontational atmosphere. Guys, that's the best you got? On that same day, Russian jets buzzed over a Polish-owned oil platform in the Baltic Sea, low enough to violate the known safety zone around the platform. But again, this was done in what were technically international waters, and while they violated a safety zone, that carries far less weight than the violation of a true airspace restriction. Then, a Russian intelligence aircraft flew barely short of NATO airspace a couple of days later, refusing to respond to attempts to reach it until the last possible moment, which, while not technically breaking any rules, really pushed things right up to the limit. The same has happened in western Ukraine repeatedly now that Russia knows NATO aircraft are positioned near the border. Russia will attack militarily insignificant targets just barely short of the border and force NATO aircraft to scramble as a precaution, even though the drones don't actually enter NATO airspace. Or take Russia's actions during America's failed attempt at a peace summit, where Vladimir Putin personally attended an Alaska summit with Donald Trump. Before, during, and after the summit, Russia gave some really lovely lip service to the idea of peace, while also hammering Ukraine with some of the most intense waves of drone attacks across the entire war until this point. In fact, Russia has even broken its own record for its largest coordinated drone and missile attack on several occasions during that same time period. That dynamic traces back over several months. Ever since Trump came into office, Putin and his inner circle have signaled their openness to peace negotiations through diplomatic statements and personal remarks. At the same time, Russia has more than tripled its rate of drone attacks against Ukraine month over month, clearly demonstrating that it seeks to escalate its actions against its neighbor rather than demonstrate to Ukraine its willingness to draw down hostilities. And all across Europe, Russia has been engaged in sabotage operations since the start of the Ukraine war, but the pace and intensity of those attacks continues to ratchet upward. From 2022 to 2023, Russia quadrupled its rate of sabotage attacks against Europe, and from 2023 to 2024, Russia tripled that rate of attacks too. Russian attacks focus on military bases, airports, railway networks, seaports, pipelines, fiber optic cables, defense contractors, and more, often including physical sabotage operations that involved explosives, electronic weapons, or even the weaponization of flows of migrants. Most recently, at the time of writing, Russia may have been responsible for a massive ransomware attack that crippled major European airports for days and is in line with both Russia's history of ransomware attacks and Russia's current focus on disrupting NATO in the air. Simultaneously, Russia is being accused of mass disinformation operations against Moldova, a nation that isn't part of NATO or the European Union, but is in a position that's very similar to pre-war Ukraine. In all cases, Russia denies these acts of subversion out of hand, and while the NATO alliance agrees on what's really going on, they've had a very difficult time organizing a coherent response to Russia's campaign. These sabotage attacks are designed to work at a relatively low level using paid third-party aggressors, cryptocurrencies, and untraceable communications that are networked through several hard-to-trace intermediaries at a time. Russia is more than 3.5 years into its invasion of Ukraine. It's estimated to have lost hundreds of thousands of fighting men and boys, or according to some figures from NATO members, perhaps over 1 million. Russia's economy is so weak and overstressed that even Putin's own Minister of Economic Development and the Bank of Russia are warning of imminent crisis, and for the first time, nations within the NATO alliance have agreed to jointly deploy troops into Ukraine after the war concludes. Yet Russia isn't slowing down its acts of sabotage, downsizing its drone waves, or scaling back its challenges to NATO airspace. It's accelerating them, it's ratcheting up tensions even further, and seeming to throw away an opportunity to come to peace terms that would fall short of victory, but would be far more acceptable than a total defeat. So, the question we've got to ask now is, well, why? Most of the time, we try not to get too deep into the prediction business, seeing as there's only ever one way for a prediction to be right and infinite ways for it to fall short of the mark. But even though we're gonna keep this prediction vague, like all the best fortune tellers do, we'll say this: something's coming. And the warning signs can be found not only in Russia's actions, but in its rhetoric. When Vladimir Putin and his allies want to take new aggressive action, they start by building a narrative. That narrative, of course, doesn't have to be backed up by any observable facts on the ground. After all, no world-class gaslighter would ever allow themselves to be held back by what their enemies' lying eyes would have them believe. But make no mistake, Russia's shadowy storytellers are hard at work laying the foundation for a new stage in this conflict. For one thing, Russia can now go to the international community and claim that it tried to find peace with the West, it tried to find common ground, but Ukraine refused to come to terms. For another, Russia can accuse the NATO alliance of trying to manufacture a confrontation. Indeed, that's already what the Kremlin is doing, claiming that NATO's response to its drone provocations are overblown and insisting that Estonia is just making up the claims of Russian fighter jets overhead. Add the potential imposition of new sanctions, plus the possibility that US tariffs could target both India and China for even daring to support Russia, and Moscow has all the narratives of grievance that it could ever want. And although Russia isn't in a particularly strong position to escalate against NATO right now, the power imbalance between Moscow and Brussels just isn't the right thing to be focused on. Vladimir Putin can't predict the future, but he's almost certainly aware that Russia's position will be worse in 2 years' time than it is today. In 5 years, Russia's position will be even worse. Shift the calendar ahead to just 2027 and Europe will be well down the path of rearmament, with production lines open, ammunition and heavy weapons starting to roll off in large quantities, and the militaries of NATO member nations growing to be considerably larger than they are today. In the United States, Donald Trump may be significantly less powerful, relegated to a lame duck presidency by a strong performance by his Democrat rivals in 2026. Russia's wartime economy is held together by little more than duct tape and toothpicks and is showing signs that it's on the verge of overheating completely. North Korea can't feed Russia its personnel forever. China's patience with Putin will run out as China gains in power, and if Ukraine's front lines haven't collapsed by now, it's not certain they ever will. Russia is not in a strong position to act aggressively toward NATO right now, but Russia's position today is about as good as a position as it's likely to be across the next several years. That wasn't always the case. Over the last few years, Western intelligence officials have suggested that Russia would be ready to attack NATO somewhere between 2027 and 2030. But now the situation is changing real fast, and Russia has reason to believe that its military disparity against NATO will grow during the next 5 years, instead of Russia narrowing the gap. If Vladimir Putin is going to act within his lifetime, then it's got to be soon. And if Russia were planning to act soon, then its history in Ukraine, in Syria, in Georgia, and all across the world would suggest that Russia's gaslighting operations would already have started to accelerate. Well, here we are. As for what that attack could look like, NATO member nations have some ideas. This June, Bruno Karl, the head of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, explained in a podcast that his agency had learned that Russia doesn't believe NATO's collective defense obligations of any real force in 2025. According to Karl, Russia was actively preparing options to build a confrontation with NATO that would stop short of full-scale war, but would reveal whether the US would actually make good on its commitments. Quoting Karl here, it's enough to send little green men to Estonia to protect supposedly oppressed Russian minorities. Recently, defense analysts have highlighted the possibility that Russia could start capturing islands or foray into Finland or Norway, while others have suggested that Russia would attempt to capture the Suwalki Gap, a thin stretch of Polish and Lithuanian land next to Belarus. More recently, in the weeks following the start of Russia's incursions into NATO airspace, Donald Trump and his aides have indicated that America would honor its commitments, but the alliance's actions tell another story. NATO's failed to shoot down Russian incoming threats, including a trio of armed fighter jets, and American air power is conspicuously absent, even as other NATO members try to make up the difference. Notably, on the day this episode was written, the Institute for the Study of War published a report indicating that Russia had added nearly 300,000 fresh recruits to its military since January of this year, forming a massive and relatively well-trained strategic reserve that has yet to reach Ukraine's front lines. Quoting the ISW here, Russia may also be building out its strategic reserve as part of wider Kremlin preparations for a possible Russia-NATO conflict in the future. So for the last decade and more, Vladimir Putin has made clear that he is the world's great master of geopolitical gaslighting. But that gaslighting isn't just an attempt by Putin to stroke his own ego. It's a valuable geopolitical signal that consistently signals when Russia is looking to defend itself or keep up the pressure or start to escalate. The fact that Russia is gaslighting is a surprise to no one, but the way that Russia is gaslighting suggests that it's time to prepare for an escalation. How Russia intends to escalate, or when or where, we simply couldn't say. But when Russia's rhetoric and its actions start to change, it's not an accident. It's never an accident. The nations of NATO would be wise to remember that and to be ready. Thank you for watching.